Good morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Everybody's good? I know that the online giving deal is a little new to us. It's something that we have recently brought into play, and some are apprehensive about using it. I found it very convenient as I was sitting there and Greg was leading us in our thoughts and prayers in regards to giving, that I was able to contribute with that. And so that was it's a neat way for us to be able to have that convenience, and also for those who want to contribute to Benny's work or Brad's work, they can do so at any time with that. So just keep that in mind as we work towards trying to make things easier, especially during this time of being online. That makes it easier when you're at home, that we can work together and stay together and contribute to the works of this congregation, the work of the Lord. As we begin this morning, we've been looking at this idea of surpassing righteousness. That has been our sermon series title this particular month, the surpassing righteousness. And we talked about Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, and we looked at Jesus as he begins to unpack this idea of having a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Remember from Matthew chapter 5. Where he says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And remember, in Matthew, that's a big question, isn't it? Who will enter the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus has been saying things up to this point that have been very surprising and shocking to the people of his day about the kind of person who will actually enter into and participate in the kingdom of heaven. So I want us to keep this idea in mind. This is one that we talked about last week, and I want us to keep this phrase in mind, that our relationship to one another, whether that be in this congregation, whether that be in the community, whether that is a relationship with our families, that our relationship with one another is a reflection of our relationship to God. That relationship that we have here in the present is important, that it means something to God, that God doesn't see those things as passing relationships, but he thinks them to be important enough to talk about them and even hold us accountable for the relationships that we have in this life. But you know, as I was thinking about this topic we're going to be looking at this morning, I've been thinking about how more often than not, we see our society as a whole just starting to, and I guess they've always kind of done this, but it's more evident now, I guess, in my mind anyway, that as the world begins to talk about things like it being okay, right? Just using that phrase, okay to, and you can fill in the blanks, right? You can be whoever you want to be. It's okay to think whatever you want to think. It's okay to say whatever you want to say. It's okay to just live your life however you want to live your life, right? To kind of live in the now, we might say, just to do what feels good right now, to do what makes you happy in the moment. If that makes you happy and that is a fulfilling life in your mind, then just go ahead and do it, because according to the world's standard of living, that's okay. That it's fine. You can go ahead and do those things and say those things and be that kind of person, and that's all right, right? And if somebody draws a line in the sand, right, somebody says, no, this is where the line is. You cannot cross this line. Then what do people have a tendency to do with the line? They have a tendency to either do one of two things. They're going to either want to go ahead and cross the line, right? Sometimes it's just because the line's there. Or they're going to have a tendency to want to move the line, right? And so they want those who are drawing the line to move the line so that they can be the person they want to be, say what they want to say, live the way they want to live, and just do whatever they want to do. And instead of living within the parameters of those barriers, those boundaries, they want to move the boundaries. They want to change where that line is being drawn. And as a society, as a whole, I think that changing these moral standards is just kind of part of what people want, isn't it? They desire to have those moral standards changed. They want definitions about what is right and what is wrong to fit their own desires. And to say that that's not possible, to say that, no, you cannot change morality, you cannot change what's right and wrong, then you're suddenly labeled, right, in society. People look at you and say, no, you can't tell somebody that they can or cannot do something. You don't have that kind of authority. And people like to move those lines as far as they can to meet their own personal desires. And as those lines are being moved, I'm afraid as followers of Jesus that there is a temptation there to move our standards along with the standards of the world. Don't you think? Right? When the world moves the line a little bit, we kind of feel like, I can stay within those boundaries. I can stay on that side of that line. I can keep within the boundary that has been set by the world, and I could still be okay in the eyes of society. And so there's this temptation there to kind of move along with the line. But then again, as followers of Jesus, we're really not concerned about where the world draws the line, are we? We're not concerned about where the world draws the line. The world's going to draw the line wherever they want. They're going to make that standard whatever they want it to be to accommodate the people who want that line to be moved. So that should not surprise us. But as followers of Jesus, we're really not concerned about where the world moves the line, but we are concerned about where God has drawn the line, right? That God has a standard of morality, that God has drawn a line and said, this is it, right? Don't cross this line. This is where you need to be. But if you cross this line, it's wrong. It's sinful. It's sin. And God has drawn lines in areas of our life. And sometimes when the world tries to move those lines, there is a temptation within us that says, I can work within those parameters. I can move my standard of morality just a little bit, and nobody's going to notice. And nobody's going to care. And nobody's going to say anything because the world is okay with that standard. The world is okay with the line being drawn over there. But we need to be more concerned about where God has drawn the line, right? Where God says this is right and this is wrong, that this is good and this is bad. That's where our heart needs to be, is where God's standard is. And as we continue through this lesson, as we think about this idea of being within these parameters and thinking about righteousness and having a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, when we think about these ideas, we need to focus on this thought, that when our desires, our deep-rooted desires, when they supersede God's desire for us, right? When our desires supersede God's desire for us, we need to start questioning those desires. We need to start looking at ourselves and evaluating ourselves and thinking about what we want versus what God actually wants for us, right? We want a right relationship with God. Most people, I believe, at least if not all people who claim to be Christian, who believe that there's a God, they want a right relationship with God, but they also want to satisfy themselves, right? There is that part of them that kind of moves back and forth. They want a right relationship with God, but they also want to satisfy themselves. And so they try to do both. You ever see people do that? Have you ever done that? Have you ever been in a position where you thought, how can I satisfy both of these things? How can I be in a right relationship with God but still satisfy my desires? And this seems to have been a dilemma even in Jesus' day. As the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the people of Jesus' day are looking at the law, right? They're looking at where God is drawing these lines. They're making these interpretations, if you will, of what God meant to say, right? And they're saying, that's where God drew the line. And they're trying to say, well, how can I stay within within those boundaries, how can I stay on this side of the line? In other words, how can I have a right relationship with God, but still have what I want to have? Still do what I want to do? Still think what I want to think? In other words, how can I kind of manipulate the situation so that it's in my favor, so that I can have both a relationship with God and what I deeply desire within me? And this seems to be what Jesus is dealing with when we start talking about Matthew chapter 5 and verse 27, which we'll read in just a minute. And remember, Jesus has already kind of laid this foundation for us, and he's already looked at this, and he said, you know, that you say what the law says, and rightfully so, that you shouldn't murder anybody, remember? And that's kind of, in their mind, that's where the line is. And if you were to ask any of them, they would say, well, I've never murdered anybody, so I'm okay. I'm on this side of the line. I'm good. But then Jesus kind of looks at that and interprets it a little differently, and he interprets it from the heart and character of God, right? And he says, okay, you've never murdered anybody, but if you're harboring hatred in your heart for your brother, if you hate and you're angry and you've got this within you, then you've crossed the line. You've gone too far. You've moved too far over the line. And they would say, no, I've never murdered anybody. I've never killed anybody. And Jesus says, but you have hatred. You hate your brother. And that's too far. Remember? And Jesus makes this point because they would like the line to be just right there. You know, don't murder anybody. All right, I'm good. I'm not going to murder anybody. But I harbor hatred in my heart for my brother. And Jesus says that is crossing the line. That's too far. Don't go there. That God doesn't want us to be there. And so when we get into chapter 5 and verse 27, it says that you have heard that it was said that you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Right? And they're fine with that. They're fine with this idea, right? Not to go as a married man, not to go and have physical contact with another woman. They're okay with that. They're okay with the line being drawn right there, right? They know that that's wrong. And they're willing to say that that's the boundary, that's the law, and I haven't crossed that. But what Jesus is saying is there's something deeper here. There's a heart issue that needs to be dealt with. And you're right. You may not have crossed the line in the sense that you have not physically pursued somebody that way or had that kind of contact. But Jesus is saying that, no, it's deeper, right? It's deeper than just going and actually doing. It is deeper than that. And you might be able to say that you've never done that, but Jesus says if you are looking... If you were looking at somebody else and you've got desire in your heart, right, and uses that word lust, you look at somebody with desire in your heart. If you've done that, you're crossing the line. And you can see how this compares to the concept of murder and hatred, right? This idea that they can have hatred in their heart and be angry and just so mad at somebody that they could kill them, but they're not going to, so therefore they're okay. And you can see how Jesus is comparing this to this concept of saying, that if a person is committed in this relationship, that they're committed to their spouse, that they have to be all in, right? They have to be all in. And just crossing the line in the sense of breaking the law in their standard would be to go and be with another woman. And Jesus says, no, if you're desiring it, if you're giving in your mind and your heart to your heart's desires, then you're crossing the line. You have gone too far. And I was thinking about David. Of course, we always kind of go to David's sin in these scenarios to help us understand this, even though we kind of know it, but it's a great illustration in 2 Samuel chapter 11 when David goes and he peeks over the fence, right? He peeks over his neighbor's fence and he sees Uriah's wife over there and he desires her. That's what Jesus is talking about. He looks at her lustfully and desires her. But he goes beyond that, doesn't he? And he takes her into his own house. and has her for his own. And when she becomes pregnant, you remember what he does? He goes even beyond that, and he attempts to cover it up. And ultimately, this whole scenario ends with the murder of Uriah and ultimately the death of that child that is born. And we see how sin progresses and how this desire that David had, right? I mean, he had all of these women to him, these wives that David had. He had authority. He had positions of power, all these things that God had given him. But there's that one thing that he desired and he lusted for, and we can see how it ultimately manifests itself in such evil and wickedness. And it's a good illustration for us to look at that and say that, if you were to have asked David at the beginning of this whole story, he probably would not have imagined it ending up the way it did. He probably thought, I'm just going to take advantage of the situation. I'm going to move on. Nobody's going to know any different. It's all going to be fine. But it wasn't fine. And it wasn't right. And his heart was clouded to the truth of the sinfulness of his actions. And I really like the way Nathan puts it in chapter 12. And we're going to look at this. In chapter 12, remember, Nathan comes along and confronts David and kind of tells David this story that is related, but it's not direct. These kind of indirect stories. And so Nathan comes along and he says to David in 2 Samuel 12 in verse 1 and 4, he says, there were these two men in one city. David's listening to this story. I'm sure Nathan's probably come in and told him other things before, but this story is a little different. He wants to know what's going on. These two men, right, in this city. And he says there's a rich one and there's a poor one. Okay, and the rich man had a great many flocks and herds, and the poor man had nothing except this little ewe lamb, which he bought and he nourished, and it grew up together with him and his children, and it would eat of his hand, and eat the bread and drink of the cup and lie in his bosom. And he says it was like a daughter to him. So we can kind of get the picture, right? We're reading through this and we're thinking about the story, and David's thinking about the story. He hasn't put two and two together yet, but he's kind of listening to the story and he's hearing what's going on here, these two characters of the story. And there's this poor man, and he's got this ewe lamb, and he loves it, and he brings it in. It's like a daughter to him. He's caring for it, and he raises it up. And then it says in chapter 4, or verse 4 rather, it says, now a traveler came to the rich man. Remember, he's the other character in the story. And he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd. Remember, he's the one that had all of the flock and the herd. He's the one that had everything to his disposal. He's the one that really had the ability to take from his own the best and to have it. But in this story, it says in the rest of that verse, it says to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him, rather he took the poor man's ewe lamb. Remember, that's that ewe lamb that the poor man loved. Remember, it wasn't just food to him. It was something he treasured. It was something that he brought into his home, that he fed and he raised up, that he held close to him. This was something that it was his only ewe lamb that he loved so dearly that was like a daughter to him. That was the one that this wealthy man comes along and takes from him. And he prepared it for the man who had come. So he slaughters it. He kills it. He makes a meal out of it. And when David hears his story, he's angry, right? He's angry at the main character. That's the irony of the whole thing. David is so mad. He's angry at the main character. And after we hear this story, we're kind of angry at the main character too, aren't we? We're thinking, man, that rotten character. I mean, how dare he do something like that? Who would do such a thing? And so David's angry at the character. We're angry at the character. And I believe that's how it's supposed to go. We're all kind of mad at this main character of the story. But what do we learn? The main character is who? It's David. David's the rich man. David's the one that had everything at his disposal. David's the one that took from the poor man all that he had. David's the one who has done that. But this main character of the story, even though in this story it's David, right? a lot of times these tragic stories are about us. And we need to sometimes stop and evaluate ourselves in such a way that we look at ourselves and we say, as the main character of my story, as the one who's living this out, as the one who's making these decisions and doing these things, and what does my story look like? What does my main character look like? If somebody were to come to me and tell me my story over again, if we had a Nathan that would come in here and tell us our stories over again, would we be angry at the main character? Would we be able to see our faults and our flaws as we are having this story unpacked for us? We have to think about these things and ask ourselves these kind of questions, because sometimes that main character in the story is us. And we need to be mindful of the things we do and the things we say and the things that we decide are right and wrong and how our desires are being controlled. So Jesus is telling the Jews, right? He's telling the Jews that you may think that you're getting away with it, right? You may think that you're getting away with it, but by not committing the physical act of adultery like David did. You may think that you're getting away with it, but you're not. You're not. You're not getting away with it. And then look at the rest of Matthew chapter 5, verse 29. It says, if your right eye, Jesus is kind of using this as an illustration to help solidify this concept. If your right eye makes you stumble, Jesus says, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of your parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And then he says in verse 30, if your right hand makes you stumble, just cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. See, Jesus is he's not promoting self-mutilation. That's not what Jesus is promoting here, but he is promoting self-control, isn't he? He's not promoting self-mutilation, but he is promoting self-control. If your eyes are controlling you, if your eyes are controlling what you think, if your eyes are controlling what you lust after, it would be better if you didn't have eyes at all. You see that? It would be better if you didn't have them. If your hand is controlling you, if your hand is controlling you, what you desire, what you want to touch, it would be better, Jesus says, if you didn't have hands. If you didn't have that hand. If that's what's controlling you, it would be better if you didn't have them. So practice self-control, right? Practice self-control. And that is better, isn't it? Controlling your desires instead of your desires controlling you. Look at verse 31. He says, it was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, we may not be extremely familiar with what Jesus is quoting here, so I want us to go and look at Deuteronomy 24. This was in the mind of the Jews at this time, and exactly what Jesus is pointing at when he's making this comment. And it says this, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. So this is what Jesus is quoting. This is what's on their mind. This is what they're thinking about. And the question in their time, in the days of the Jews, in Jesus' day, the big question was, what does this phrase actually mean? Right? What is the phrase that he has found some indecency in her? That's what they wanted to know. They wanted to know the answer to that question, right? Forget about everything they knew about God, right? I mean, forget about everything they knew about marriage. Forget about everything they knew about God's character and what God desires in relationships. Forget all about that. What does this word indecency mean? Because if I can make that phrase mean what I want it to mean, if I can make that phrase mean what I want it to mean, then I can fulfill my desire. You see how they're trying to manipulate that? If I can make that phrase mean whatever I want it to mean, if I can interpret that differently than what I kind of think it means, what I really believe it means deep down inside, if I can make it mean something else, then I can fulfill my desire. And in this scenario, it's the desire to put away my wife for another woman, to put her away so I can have somebody else. If I can make it mean whatever I want it to mean, I can have what I want and stay within the boundaries of the law. And so in Jesus' day, this was a huge question. In fact, you can go and look at the different rabbis that had all the lists of things that they would fill in the blank for indecency in this passage. And just a few of them, there was one rabbi who would say that if she burns your dinner, then that's grounds for divorce, that you can go ahead and divorce her because she's burnt your dinner, and that's some indecency that you found in her. Or maybe if she showed some of her ankle, in public, oh, that's grounds for divorce. And so they had all of these different rules and ideas and different rabbis, whoever you wanted to listen to at any given time, to tell you what that phrase means, so that they can have grounds for divorcing their wife, marrying another, and still in their mind, logistically, staying within the boundaries of the law. They want to move the line to fit their own desires. Look at verse 32. It says, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity or unfaithfulness, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." You see, when we try to move the line that God has drawn to fulfill our desires, we failed. You see what Jesus is saying? That when you try to move the line, that God has drawn, when he has established marriage, when he has established relationships, when he has put all this together and he says, this is the way it is. And when our desires are causing us to try to move that line, we have failed, right? When you send your wife away with a certificate of divorce, just because you desire another woman, right? Just because you want somebody else, you have moved the line to fit your desires. And when you look at a woman with lust for her, you have already committed adultery for her in your heart. You have crossed the line. You've crossed the line, right? And as we said before, if it is true, right? If it is true that our relationship to one another is a reflection of our relationship to our God, what does this say about their relationship to God? What does it say about their relationship to God when they are trying to fulfill their desires by trying to move the line and manipulate the words of God to fit their own needs and their own wants? What does this say about their relationship to God? When their commitment to their spouse is like this, right? What does it say about their relationship to their God? And what does it say about our relationship to our God when our desires supersede our commitment to our spouse? What does it say when our commitment is so on the line that we're just saying, well, if somebody else comes along and I desire that other person more, I need to have a way out so that I can fulfill my desires? What does that say about us, right? What does it say about us, right? If you cannot be faithful to your spouse, will you ever be truly faithful to your God? Remember, we talked about this. Relationships to God matter. They mean something. They're significant. God establishes these relationships. He brings us together even as a community of believers, and he expects those relationships to have fulfilled expectations. But if we are constantly looking out at something else and looking to fulfill our desires, what does that say about our relationship to our God? And what about the church? What about the church? What about the bride of Christ? Right? Are we committed to the church? Are we truly committed to the community that Jesus has brought us into by his blood? Are we committed to this, or are we lustfully looking into the world and what the world has to offer? And are we looking out of this community into a different world and saying, you know, they have what I want? How can I have that and this? How can I have community? How can I be part of the church? How can I be here in this relationship to God through Jesus as the bride of Christ? How can I do this and have that? How can I move the line in such a way that I can fulfill my desires but still be within the boundaries of the law, right? And when we allow our desires, the desires of our body, to supersede his desire for his body, folks, we are being unfaithful to the commitment that we made to Jesus. We're moving the line. We're moving the line. See, we need to be diligent, don't we? To control our desires instead of having our desires controlling us. If we are going to have a righteousness that surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, that relationship that goes deeper than the surface, we are going to have a heart that is truly committed to the will of God. And that goes beyond the surface, doesn't it? It goes beyond a certificate. It goes deep into the heart of a relationship. And we know what that looks like. You know, we kind of pretend like we don't know what it looks like, and we act kind of surprised when things go wrong. But we all know. We know what it looks like to have a deep, meaningful relationship with one another. We know what it looks like to be part of a community that truly loves each other and loves others and loves their neighbor as themselves. We know what it looks like because Jesus has so clearly shown us what it looks like to truly love in such a way that we're willing to sacrifice for somebody else's needs and not fulfill our own desires lustfully. We know what that looks like. And Jesus is challenging the Jews of his day, and he's challenging us today to go out and actually live it. Don't move the line to fit your desires, but change your heart. Change your heart to fulfill the expectations of God. If there's anybody here this morning who's struggling with commitment, if you're struggling with life and you just need the prayers of this congregation for encouragement and strength, or if there's anybody here who desires to become part of this community by putting on Jesus in baptism, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
All to Jesus I surrender, all to